We're going to continue our exploration on sine and cosine values, but now we're going to look at all the quadrants, all the values that we could possibly have. Now, I've written out our values already from the ones we looked at in the last video. And I've written out as ordered pairs. So the x-coordinate here is our cosine value, and then the y-coordinate is our sine value, and I've written them in terms of our radians. I've looked at everything from 0 degrees up to pi over 2 0 radians up to pi over 2 radians. So again, these are from our previous video. If you need to, look back and take a look at those. What we're going to do is continue our exploration by taking our values and kind of extending it out. So first thing I'm going to do is look at these values here because those are going to be easier ones to find. I know that if all the way around the circle is 2 pi radians, this would be halfway. I would call this pi radians. And I know the ordered pair there is going to be -1, 0. Halfway between 1 and 2 is 1.5, or another way to think of that is 3/2 pi, so 3 pi over 2, and the coordinate there would be 0 and -1. So what we're trying to do then is figure out in each quadrant what are our values going to be. Let's first start thinking about sines. And not sine isn't S-I-N-E, but sines isn't S-I-G-N. What are the coordinates in quadrant 1? We know they're all positive. The x-coordinate's positive and the y-coordinate's positive. In quadrant 2, we know that the x-coordinate's going to be negative and the y-coordinate's going to be positive. In quadrant 3, both the x and the y are going to be negative. And in quadrant 4, x is positive and y, not -1, just negative, and y is going to be negative. So what we're going to be doing is taking these values that we already have in quadrant 1 and effectively moving them into quadrant 2. So let's start with the pi over 6s. If we go to quadrant 2, there's an angle that's going to be right about here. And we know that we're pi over 6 short of pi. Pi then would be 6 pi over 6. This angle we would call 5 pi over 6. That quadrant, we know the x-coordinate is going to be negative and the y-coordinate is going to be positive. So we're going to use our coordinates that we have here and just make a modification. Let me try writing that again to give our ordered pair. Cosine then of 5 pi over 6 is -√3 over 2, and the sine of 5 pi over 6 is 1/2. If I keep going with that into quadrant 3, we're pi over 6 past pi, so now that's 7 pi over 6. And we know that both coordinates should be negative, so -√3 over 2 and -1/2. Cosine of 7 pi over 6 is -√3 over 2. Sine of 7 pi over 6 is -1/2. This is the tricky one, quadrant 4. 2 pi is the same thing as 12 pi over 6. So if we take one away, that gives us 11 pi over 6. And in quadrant 4, we know that the x-coordinate's positive, so it's a positive √3 over 2 for the cosine. And the y-coordinate's negative, so it's a -1/2 for the sine value of that angle. We're going to do the same thing with our pi over 4s. We're going to go into quadrant 2. So again, we're pi over 4 short of 1. So that would give us 3 pi over 4, 3/4. We know that x is negative, so -√2 over 2 for the cosine, and y is positive, so positive √2 over 2 for the sine. In quadrant 3, we're pi over 4 past pi, so that's 5 pi over 4. And we know that both of our coordinates, the cosine and the sine, are going to be negative, and they're both going to be √2 over 2. In quadrant 4, we do the same thing. We're pi over 4 short of 2 pi, and this now represents 8 pi over 4. So we take one away, we're at 7 pi over 4. X is positive, so it's a positive √2 over 2, and y is negative, so it's a negative √2 over 2 for the sine value. And quadrant 2 with pi over 3s, again, we're pi over 3 short of 1 pi. So that'd be 3 pi over 3. This now becomes 2 pi over 3. The x is negative, so a -1/2 for the cosine. And the y is positive, so it's √3 over 2 for the sine. Quadrant 3 down here, we're pi over 3 past pi, so 4 pi over 3. Again, both coordinates negative, so we take what we have in quadrant 1. So it makes it a negative 1/2 for the cosine and a negative root 3 over 2 for the sine. And then quadrant 4, we're pi over 3 short of 2 pi. That is now 6 pi over 3. So this becomes 5 pi over 3. X is positive, so it's a positive 1/2 still for the cosine. And the y is negative, so it's root 3 over 2, making it negative root 3 over 2 for the sine. So the way I like to think about this, if I'm thinking about, the 5 pi over 3, they asked me for the cosine, let's say the cosine of 7 pi over 4. I want to think about what quadrant I'm in first. Am I in quadrant 1, 2, 3, or 4? Once I've figured that out, then I can start figuring out, is it positive or negative, and how does it relate to the original? So like the cosine of 7 pi over 4, we know is in quadrant 4. It's a positive x, so it's going to have the same value as pi over 4. If they said something like the sine of 7 pi over 6, I know that I'm just past pi, so I'm in quadrant 3, and it's going to be negative then. Your sines and cosines are negative in quadrant 3. So take your sine value in quadrant 1 and make it negative. So it's really important that you know your quadrant 1 values so that we can extend them to quadrant 2, quadrant 3, and quadrant 4.